And I've had to fight an endless guerrilla war now for more than 40 years against the flood tide, which is still now only beginning to subside. People who tried to convince themselves and others that skin pigmentation, sexual orientation, gender, ethnic origins were what mattered about deciding what was or what was not worth reading. I found that obscene and still do. But I have made more vitriolic enemies in that camp than any other. Well, I really am the pariah of my profession in the English-speaking world. I had to walk out. I resigned from the Yale English department, where I'd been a faculty member from 1955 on. In 1976, I went to the acting president and provost of Yale, Hannah Gray, and petitioned the Yale Corporation, that is to say the trustees through her, to release me from the Department of English. And I haven't been a professor of English since then. I've a non-department of one with the president of Yale, whoever it is at a particular time. Now it's a very splendid president, Rick Levin, as my chair. And I have no colleagues. Sometimes it's lonesome, but I'm the sterling professor of the humanities, but there's no department of the humanities. There's a center for the humanities and so on. But I can't even be there anymore because the stairs are too hard for me to climb. So I'm isolated at Yale and have been for a very long time now, except in terms of my students. Initially, it was the school of T.S. Eliot, the Yale and other new critical disciples of T.S. Eliot, a great poet, but I think a vicious and nasty literary critic and cultural polemicist. And it's not too much to say, a professional anti-Semite whom I hold in the greatest contempt, though alas, a great poet. I would reluctantly have to concede, since I think I know all of the great poetry by heart. That doesn't mean I like him or ever could like him. He's dead a long time now, of course. But the school of Eliot, which despised the Romantic poets, despised Walt Whitman, despised Hart Crane, denigrated Wallace Stevens, didn't feel that Blake was a poet or Shelley was a poet. I fought them tooth and nail at Yale and elsewhere. And by the time they were vanquished and all that, I had a new set of enemies. The school of deconstruction, the late Paul de Man, the late Jacques Derrida, the still living J. Hillis Miller and Jeffrey Hartman, all my good friends. But and I got confused with them sometimes, but I was never a deconstructionist. Not now, not then, never would be. I didn't believe that you could reduce literature to perpetual ironies, as my friend Paul de Man liked to say, the permanent parabasis of meaning, which he followed Friedrich Schlegel. And then when I was done battling them and they had one way or another vanished, then came the major struggle of my life. From 1968 on, the great cultural revolution swept over the entire world, born out of something very worthwhile indeed, student and humane revulsion to the horrors of the dreadful fascist American war against the Vietnamese. I wish to make something very clear. I am a lifelong democratic socialist. I am not a conservative. I'm not a cultural conservative. I'm anything but a political conservative. I loathe political conservatism and religious conservatism, but nevertheless, I do believe in cognitive and aesthetic values, and I've had to fight an endless guerrilla war now for more than 40 years against the flood tide, which is still now only beginning to subside. People who tried to convince themselves and others that skin pigmentation, sexual orientation, gender, ethnic origins were what mattered about deciding what was or what was not worth reading. I found that obscene and still do. But I have made more vitriolic enemies in that camp than any other. Mind you, authentic feminism and authentic feminist literary criticism, I not only believe in both, but I fathered feminist literary criticism, as my friends Susan Gubar and Sandra Gilbert will testify, or indeed my dear student Camille Paglia will more than testify. But I think that so-called feminist literary criticism is like the Holy Roman Empire, neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. In the same way, feminist literary criticism is not feminist. It's not literary, and it's certainly not criticism, as is usually practiced. I'm not talking about Gilbert and Gubar. I'm not talking about Elaine Showalter and other people with minds. I'm talking about the rabblement, as I call them, the rabblement of lemmings again. But I don't want to get into these polemics. You know, I'm 81 years old and counting. There's no point in my getting involved in further polemics. You know, as the great Karl Marx, with whom I have no quarrel with Marx himself, said, "Let the dead bury the dead." I've given up teaching graduate students because I'm alienated from all of these movements that have politicized criticism, and from cultural politics of all kinds, which I simply can't abide. What I call the school of resentment, and I've characterized them as a rabblement of lemmings. My two great mottos as a critic, when they don't come from Dr. Johnson, come from Groucho Marx. One is, I wouldn't be a member of any club that would have me for a member, and the other is, whatever it is, I'm against it. But in any case, I always teach 2 seminars of a dozen undergraduates each, very carefully selected because there are so many applicants. And I try to be fair, but I also want people who I think will benefit most by it. And one discussion group is always in Shakespeare, and the other is in how to read poems. And I have the students, the normal procedure I've followed, and I've worked it out through the years, and it works perfectly now, I think. For one thing, it makes me shut up, and I have a tendency to talk too much. I tell them that possession by memory is a really crucial matter, and that the only way to do it is to go off by yourself quietly and read out loud to yourself again and again until it enters you. And, you know, people underestimate how important memory is for thinking of any kind. I mean, we all try to live in democracies. I greatly fear that the United States increasingly is not a democracy. It shows every sign of becoming an oligarchy, a plutocracy, and alas, a theocracy. The Tea Party fascists are enveloping us, and I really fear for the future of this nation, in which case I fear for the future of the world. And I blame it on ignorance. I blame it on the fact that people have forgotten how to read. If you remember the best that has been written, the best that has been uttered, said, if you read the best and hold on to it, then you will think better and more clearly, because without memory there is no clear thinking, and without clear thinking there can be no democracy. Gertrude Stein said wonderfully, one writes for oneself and for strangers. I try not to write for anyone I actually know, including my own students, or I think I have by now 35 or 40,000 former students. After all, I'm going to be starting my 56th consecutive year of teaching full-time at Yale, and I taught for 20 years authorized moonlighting at New York University, and I've taught many times at the University of Bologna and the University of Rome in Italy and other universities abroad and here at home. One writes for oneself and for strangers. I write for the common readers wherever they are, and I visualize them as people of all ages, but I hope particularly younger people, who really have a deep calling to read, solitary readers I would call them, who wish to go apart and read for themselves, who are tired of the drone of the media in their ears, are tired of visual overstimulation. We live in a culture where people are forgetting how to read, because between the television screen and the computer screen and the motion picture screen, reading and thinking are being drubbed out, are being pulverized, and it is a very terrible kind of thing. One of my discussion groups, or any one of them, begins with my asking particular students to read a poem or a Shakespearean soliloquy or speech or passage out loud, and then for her or him to comment on what they've just read, and then I encourage the other students to get involved, and I lean back and listen to them speak to one another, and I speak only when spoken to or when I feel I might help a little with directing it, but I no longer blather at them the way I did when I was young and middle-aged or even in early old age. Now that I'm so considerably older, I want to listen to them. I want to listen to them in a way in which very gently they're guided to speak at their best, really, getting away from the excessive stimuli of the media, this endless noise with which they are assaulted, asking them to go apart and read for themselves. And I really don't distinguish between the readers I seem to have all over the world, and I'm very grateful for that, whom I will never meet, though I can't handle the letters I get. I can't handle the thousands of emails. I just have to hope that they'll be patient with me and not think that I'm not moved. I even get telephone calls from young people all over the world, in particular whom I've never met and never will meet. And at times it's exhausting. And of course there's also the flood of unsolicited manuscripts, which is just too much for me. I can't deal with that. I wouldn't be able to do my own work or live my own life. But I don't distinguish between these unknown readers around the world, or indeed in my own country, in whatever language that I'm translated into. I don't distinguish between them and the students I have taught in the past or whom I will have teaching me and I'll be teaching them.
Like, subscribe, notification bell, join the herd.